The departure hall of a mid-sized Mediterranean airport smelled of espresso and new leather. Fluorescent lights hummed above a corridor where rolling suitcases tapped like a soft percussion, and the echo of announcements folded into the murmur of conversations. A security scanner blinked a steady blue, a child laughed at a toy airplane, and a man in an unremarkable jacket smoothed the strap of his bag with a fingertip that betrayed no tremor. He looked ordinary enough to be invisible, which is precisely what made him visible to those who had been watching. How do states decide that intercepting a single figure between two borders is worth a clandestine operation that will skirt rules and raise questions for months to come? That is the question this story will follow. In the minutes ahead, you will learn who the man in transit purported to be, why multiple intelligence services considered him critical enough to track, and how a cross-border operation was planned to capture him without leaving a conventional trail. You will see the balance of logistics and dissimulation that allowed agents to embed themselves in coffee shops, hotels, and terminal lounges, and you will weigh the legal and moral prerogatives that knot themselves around extrajudicial actions. If you value investigative narratives that reveal what happens in plain sight, like this video. If you want more deep dives into clandestine coordination and international law, subscribe. There was a 30-second window in a narrow arrivals corridor that decided almost everything. Let us begin with the man who was moving between planes. He was known to many names and to few faces. In dossiers, he appeared as Ahmad Barak, though interviews with defectors suggested the name was one layer of a multi-layered identity. His backstory read like a study in transition and contradiction. Born to a refugee family in the late 1970s, he spent a childhood marked by sporadic schooling and early recruitment into local networks that linked ideology, survival, and commerce. As a young man, he learned logistics the hard way by running consignments across informal borders, alternating between legal trade and smuggling to keep a household afloat. He studied briefly at a religious college where a mentor recognized his aptitude for languages and recruited him into an intelligence cell as a courier. Over the next decade, the lines between courier, coordinator, and commander blurred. His training was practical rather than formal, refined in market squares and back offices rather than academies. He developed a reputation for discipline, a calm voice on encrypted calls, and an ability to negotiate safe passage for people and funds. For those who tracked him, his ascent mattered because he connected financial threads and operational cells across multiple cities. The backstory that defined him was not only biography, but function. It explained why analysts like Farid Alami in a regional intelligence center flagged him as a node rather than a single actor. It also made him human in the manner that mattered for journalists and a person with childhood losses, a tutor who taught him to read maps by candlelight, friends who became allies, and a wife who had left years earlier. That mixture of ordinary suffering, acquired skills, and moral ambiguity complicated any straightforward assessment of culpability and created the fog that shrouded decisions to intercept rather than to hunt in open legal venues. To understand why this transit mattered, one had to place it inside a broader political climate. The year was one of high tensions. Diplomatic channels were frayed. Humanitarian corridors were under strain. Accusations had been traded in capitals and social media feeds alike. Precedents existed for targeted operations, each invoking the language of plausible deniability and strategic necessity. Neighboring states had repeatedly cited concerns over financing networks that enabled attacks in urban centers and over the use of civilian travel for operational movement. Analysts traced a pattern where logistics cells adapted rapidly to pressure, fragmenting and reassembling so that short-term disruption rarely eliminated a capability permanently. International law scholars debated whether intercepting a suspected commander during transit outside the suspect's home jurisdiction could be justified by imminent threat or by prerogatives of self-defense. The legal argument often hinged on the quality of intelligence and the availability of extradition or mutual legal assistance. Politically, the calculus was simple yet brutal. A visible arrest could provoke diplomatic fallout and public scrutiny. A covert capture minimized immediate visibility but risked accusations of extrajudicial behavior and damage to long-term credibility. The operation planners therefore existed between two fears: the immediate threat and the long-term erosion of norms. The preparation for the operation unfolded over weeks in safe rooms, in hotel lobbies, and in encrypted chats that left little more than metadata in their wake. The operational cell included Daniel Reed, a lead field operative with prior experience in special missions, and Miriam Kovacs, an expert in cover identities and in establishing credible civilian presences. They worked with local fixer Yusuf Haddad, who understood border blind spots, and with analyst Farid Alami, who maintained a running intelligence mosaic of financial transfers and communication patterns. A liaison officer at a nearby embassy, Mark Evans, coordinated diplomatic cover, while Dr. Lena Schwartz supported forensic planning and preservation of a chain of custody that could survive later scrutiny. A journalist named Rachel Stein was listed in day planners only as a contingency contact in case public narratives needed shaping. Planning sessions smelled of strong coffee and of printer toner. Agents ran through plausible itineraries, testing which hotels created the least suspicion, which check-in counters had predictable staffing, and which cafes allowed for quiet observation. They rehearsed nonviolent containment techniques in a training compound, working on timing and coordination rather than on lethal options. Dialogue was constant and iterative as they adjusted to new pieces of information. Daniel said, "I need a clean line to his itinerary now." Miriam replied, "We have a pattern but not a crystal ball." Yusuf said, "I can move a driver into place, but I need paperwork." Farid said, "Intelligence suggests he will change flights in the transit city." Mark said, "Consular cover is thin but usable." Lena cautioned, "Keep evidence protocols intact for any seizure." Rachel said, "Be mindful of the optics if this leaks." Each exchange carried subtext about risk tolerance and legal constraints. They debated the threshold at which a capture would be authorized, insisting that plausible deniability be maintained without turning the operation into an act of suppression. Sensory details anchored their rehearsals: the heft of the fake passports, the chalky taste of long hours of coffee, the squeak of training sneakers on a gym floor, the soft tick of a wall clock keeping time while they counted the hours to departure. Moments of friction were resolved by iteration. The group introduced 5 additional local contacts who would play small but essential parts. Captain Omar Benari of the Transit City Security, who could create a temporary distraction. Lawyer Hana Al-Balawi, who would consult on detention procedures. Logistician Amir Saleh, who arranged vehicles. An ex-agent named Thomas Graves, who offered tradecraft advice, and a communications tech called Layla Mansour, who managed secure messaging. Each was given a clear role and a plausible backstory so their presence would not betray the operation under casual questioning. At roughly 1/3 into this narrative, pause and consider a question we often hear and which you might want to answer in the comments. Facing the complexity we have described, do you think it is justifiable for a state to carry out a covert capture of a suspected militant outside its jurisdiction when extradition seems unlikely and imminent harm is alleged? If you think it is justifiable, write "justifiable" and one sentence explaining why. If you think it is unacceptable, write "unacceptable" and one sentence explaining why. If you have a follow-up question, suggest it and I may address selected comments in a future episode. Your responses help frame how these stories are received and guide possible clarifications. Return now with that reaction as we follow how the agents moved from planning to presence. The execution unfolded during a long layover, in a crowded arrivals corridor where the sensory palette betrayed nothing of the stakes. The smell of sour citrus cleaning solution mingled with the metallic tang of airport ventilation. Fluorescent lights washed pale the faces of travelers. A call tone, brief and unobtrusive, signaled a last-minute change. At the center of it, a narrow window of opportunity opened 30 seconds, just enough for an intercept team to act and to extract the subject to a secured vehicle. The scene contained a dialogue of its own. The silent conversation between timing and movement. Exchanges between agents were precise. Daniel whispered, "Hold until the man steps left." Miriam nodded and adjusted her scarf to mask a radio earpiece. Yusuf signaled with a throat clear that passed as a cough. Omar moved a security rope a few steps aside to funnel foot traffic. Layla confirmed the line with a single yes. The man in the jacket paused to check his phone, a micro-pause that became the hinge of the event. The team converged with practiced economy. Physical contact was minimal and designed to avoid escalation. An operative guided the man by the elbow as if offering directions. A second operative secured a shoulder and murmured a phrase rehearsed in the drill that indicated compliance. No weapons were presented in public view. The extraction team walked him through service doors into a back corridor that smelled of dust, printer ink, and stale air conditioning. For 2 minutes, their breathing measured in their chests felt inexorably loud. This was a moment of tension. Agents recalled family faces to steady nerves. The target offered no resistance, but his eyes betrayed surprise. He spoke one sentence in a language that meant apology or explanation. The operative answered with a command and a soft touch guiding him forward. For the watching team, the tension was a compressed narrative of potential collapse and relief. They preserved minimal material evidence and took steps to ensure subsequent legal processes could be supported if required. The immediate reactions after the operation were a mix of official silence and rumor. The transit state reported a disruption in movement that it attributed to a routine security operation without naming the target. International media published conflicting accounts, some claiming a rendition, others asserting a lawful arrest. Within the network from which the subject had risen, there was a flurry of recalibration. Financial nodes rerouted and safe houses shifted. Contacts like Amir and Hana received hurried messages to close accounts and to advise members on suspicious movements. On the public front, embassies exchanged terse notes, and a regional human rights NGO demanded transparency about the circumstances of detention. Rachel Stein, who had been kept at a distance from operational details, published an investigative piece that emphasized the lack of public judicial oversight and raised questions about chain of custody for any evidence. At an internal meeting, Mark emphasized the need to manage diplomatic fallout, while Fareed focused on analyzing how the interruption would affect tactical capabilities of associated cells. The public felt only the tremors, the way news cycles chewed the story into versions and howls. Friends and extended family of the detained man insisted on due process and sought legal counsel through Hana. The next days multiplied statements, some denials, some acknowledgments that a security incident had occurred. The balance of secrecy and accountability began to tilt into a political equation. Investigations that followed presented competing narratives and unresolved technical questions. A forensic examination of materials seized at the time of detention yielded fragments of financial records and encrypted devices that spoke in metadata more than in human-readable logs. Dr. Lena Schwartz described the first forensic impressions with caution, emphasizing that digital artifacts required painstaking reconstruction and that chain of custody had been preserved in so far as possible under field conditions. Critics contested that assessment, arguing the operation's constraints may have compromised evidence integrity. Independent analysts raised alternative hypotheses. One, that the man had been misidentified due to overlapping travel aliases. Another, that internal rivalries within the group he was associated with had produced a setup. Interviews with former associates produced divergent accounts, some implicating him in coordination of transfers, others defending his role as a logistics facilitator without direct involvement in violent plots. The multiplicity of versions complicated both prosecution and public judgment. Forensic reports arrived slowly, often punctuated by redactions and technical caveats. Legal teams debated admissibility and the extent to which confessions obtained under custody would be admissible in courts that demanded sovereign consent for extradition. The clearest thing that emerged was uncertainty, and the persistence of uncertainty shaped the next strategic moves. Strategically, the operation produced a mix of immediate disruption and adaptive resilience. Tactical interruption was measurable, certain wire transfers stalled, and several planned movements were scrubbed for several weeks. Cells adapted by decentralizing funding and by shifting to cash-based exchanges, making tracking harder. Politically, Allied states faced strained communication. Some officials used the operation to argue for stronger cross-border cooperation. Others warned against normalizing covert captures that bypassed legal frameworks. The calculus of deterrence shifted, but only incrementally. Networks rebuilt along different fault lines, showing both fragility and adaptability. Names that had been peripheral rose to fill organizational vacuums. Analysts like Farid and Thomas tracked emergent patterns and advised interlocutors that while capability had been degraded in the short term, the absence of transparent legal process would complicate long-term legitimacy of any resulting prosecutions. The operation also produced internal debates among planners. Daniel and Miriam exchanged messages about whether the risk had been proportionate. Miriam asked aloud if the operation's long-term costs were worth the immediate disruptions. Daniel answered that the decision had been taken at higher levels and that operatives could only execute or refuse. The episode highlighted the tension between operational necessity and moral accountability. The final section brings us to reflection and to a time-based epilogue that traces consequences 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months after the capture. 1 month later, the immediate operational gains were visible but messy. Travel routes that had been used for financial transfers were interrupted, and 3 mid-level facilitators were arrested or relocated. Captain Omar's intervention had created a brief intelligence window that allowed analysts to map some of the network's payment nodes. Financial oversight units issued freezes that complicated short-term funding. Humanitarian groups flagged unintended consequences. This interdiction exacerbated shortages in certain areas, as informal traders who depended on fragile financial flows lost revenue. Politically, there was shallow calm. Some governments praised the action privately while publicly expressing cautious concern. Legal efforts to secure formal extradition or to open criminal proceedings had begun but were sluggish and contested. The detained man's legal counsel requested access and documented concerns about interrogation conditions. Public commentary was polarized, and NGO coalition filed preliminary complaints demanding transparency. 3 months on, the landscape had shifted again. The group's structure had shown resilience. New facilitators had emerged, and cash operations persisted. Intelligence reports showed a partial unraveling of the network's centralized lines, but also a move toward tighter compartmentalization that made future interception harder. Investigations produced mixed outcomes. Some evidence was deemed admissible in certain jurisdictions, while other leads stalled due to lack of cross-border cooperation. International debate intensified on the prudence of covert captures without clear legal frameworks. Parliamentary hearings in 2 allied states summoned officials to explain the legal basis of cross-border coordination. The detained man's status remained a point of legal contention. His defenders continued to press for formal charges and a transparent process. The effect on local populations was diffuse. Some felt safer because perceived threats had been disrupted. Others felt vulnerable because security measures had increased scrutiny of ordinary travel and commerce. 6 months later, the operation's legacy had calcified into a set of contested precedents. Strategically, the short-term gains were outpaced by an adaptive response from the network. Cells operated with more robust dissimulation and had diversified financing channels. Politically, the episode had produced modest policy changes. Certain transit states refined their legal agreements for handling foreign detainees, and some agencies increased oversight to avoid erosion of chain of custody. Public debate had matured into a conversation about norms. Many argued that without transparent judicial review, the risk of abuse increased, and that security prerogatives required clearer legal constraints. The detained individual's case remained unresolved in the public record. Some jurisdictions had accepted portions of the evidence, while others refused extradition, citing procedural concerns. Across the board, the operation had forced institutions to confront trade-offs between immediate protective action and the preservation of legal standards that underpin international cooperation. There are images that linger beyond facts. The man in a plain jacket smoothing the strap of his bag now exists in many narratives as either a dangerous facilitator or as a victim of overreach. We know that the operation produced disruption in financial channels and offered intelligence gains. We also know that the ensuing disputes over evidence, chain of custody, and legal jurisdiction left open questions about accountability. At stake is a moral dilemma. When states act outside visible legal processes in the name of preventing harm, they may protect some at the expense of eroding norms that protect many. That tension is why these stories matter. They are not only about logistics or about a single capture. They are about how societies choose to balance security and rule of law. If this exploration helped you think through those choices, subscribe for more investigations that unpack the trade-offs between clandestine action and democratic accountability. Share your view in the comments using justifiable or unacceptable and a sentence explaining why. Your perspective helps shape the conversation and may guide future episodes that examine similar operations and their legal and ethical fallout.